often talk about how the aftermath of World War I led to the outbreak of World War II, but I also think this could be said of the war in Asia and the Pacific. In this scenario, the desire by the French in particular to take a pound of flesh from Germany are overridden by the acceptance of the 14 points, which had a softer treatment of the Germans in mind. But Japan famously, or infamously, got little to nothing of what they wanted out of the peace. Does that change here? And what is the result of this in relation to Japan's aspirations that led to the War of the Pacific? Ultimately, I see little difference in the treatment of Japan. While they had demonstrated themselves to be more of a power than anyone in the West really cared to admit in the aftermath of the Russo-Japanese War, the European powers would have little interest in giving Japan any of their demands. China would still be humiliated by the Japanese requests, and tensions between the two Asian nations would grow. There would still be an invasion of Manchuria in the early 1930s. This would, as in our timeline, be seen as a threat to European interest in China, stoking tensions between East and West. The timing is bad for the West though. They're in the early throes of the Great Depression and still dealing with war fatigue. Even here, with an earlier end to the Great War, there is a mere decade and a half gap between the end of that war and the outbreak of the hostilities in China. The thing I could see getting the Western powers involved is Japanese attacks on colonies. This would be harder for the West since there were cuts to militaries in the aftermath of the Treaty of Versailles as it exists in this timeline. If the Japanese were to attack colonies, their owners would be harder pressed to try to defend them. This might not be a problem, however. Even if the Romanovs failed in the early years of the Great Depression, no Soviet Union exists. If no Soviet Union exists, it seems unlikely that a communist uprising would take place in China. If this be the case, then the Chinese, not dealing with their civil war themselves, are more able to hold out against the Japanese, and the war in Manchuria is much more protracted. This scenario has probably avoided World War II in Europe, and depending how things go in China, it might avoid the larger war in the Asian Pacific theater. This really isn't cause for celebration though, because China, the most populous nation in the world with nearly a quarter of the world's population, gets dragged into a worse slog. The lack of a civil war in this scenario means little to nothing for the death toll as the cruel Japanese forces bring hell to the nation. I believe that trying to determine who wins this conflict and how it plays out is beyond the scope of this project.